Now that we have a Django DRF endpoint, we're now going to learn how to test our Django REST framework APIs using Swagger UI, which is a powerful and interactive documentation tool. In this project, we're going to be using DRF Spectacular. This is a very popular library that automatically generates OpenAPI compliant documentation for our DRF project. So OpenAPI, also known as Swagger, is the standard for describing RESTful APIs. It allows both developers and non-developers to easily see what endpoints exist, what data they accept, and what responses they return. So we're going to be using this primarily to interact with our endpoints and to view how our Redis-enabled application is managing and handling the data that's being sent into the API. So we're not going to be building a front end to our shopping cart in this project. We're simply going to be using this Swagger tool to interact with our application. Like the Django REST framework, we have already installed DRF Spectacular, so it is already available and installed on our image, and of course then available in our container. So the first job is to enable it. So in the installed apps, let's close down. In the core settings, let's just make sure that we register it, DRF Spectacular. Okay, so at the bottom of the settings module, let's add the REST Framework default schema class. So it tells Django REST Framework to use the DRF Spectacular as the tool for generating OpenAPI Swagger schema documentation for your API. By default, DRF doesn't generate a full Swagger OpenAPI schema unless you configure a third-party tool like this. What you might also like to do is to configure the documentation that will be generated to include a title, description, and version that's suitable for your project. Now we move over to the core URLs, and from DRF Spectacular views, we import Spectacular API view and Spectacular Swagger view, and that's going to enable the Swagger UI. So now we can set up two paths, one for the schema and one for the docs. That's going to enable, like I said, for us to access the documentation via /docs. The schema endpoint sets up an endpoint that serves the OpenAPI schema for your API. So tools like Swagger UI will use this to automatically build the interactive API documentation. So the schema holds all the information related to the endpoints that we've created, and so that can then be used to actually generate the user interface. So with that done, we shouldn't necessarily have to restart our Django container, but if it has got stuck, you can just restart it. That won't be a problem. And now we can head over to our browser, go to localhost/docs, and you'll now see the Swagger UI. Now this is an interactive UI in that we can interact with the endpoints and we can execute and send requests to the endpoint. And if we have different types of endpoints which allow us to insert or send additional data, we should be able to provide those parameters. So this is a simple get endpoint. So you can see that we don't have any parameters here to send along with the request. So we simply just execute to send the request, and that then returns a response. And we can see the response. As expected, we return all the products in the product table, just the ID, name, and price. Remember, that is being restricted by the serializer. So from this point onwards, this is how we're going to interact with our endpoints, which are, of course, Redis enabled. And that's going to allow us to simulate the requests that would be sent by the front end to manage our cart. Now from this point onwards, I will be using Google Chrome browser because it provides a nice interface for us to view what's happening behind the scenes in this admin panel. Now to access this admin panel on the Mac, I press Fn and F12. On Windows, I think it's just F12 will bring up this panel. And from here, like I said, we'll be able to look under the hood. And that's going to be important as we build different API endpoints. Okay, so that's the Swagger UI. That's what we're going to be using primarily to interact with our endpoints once we start to hook up with our Redis database. And of course, build our shopping cart.